Hello and a warm welcome to this micro lecture on frictional force. What is frictional force?
Frictional force is often defined as the force which opposes the movement of an object in contact with another object. Clearly, this sliding block is subjected to a frictional force.
In this scenario, the wooden block does not move. Does this mean that it is not subjected to any frictional force? If there is no frictional force, why doesn't the wooden block slide down due to gravitational force? Now, let's put the wooden block on a flat surface. The wooden block does not move. Is it the frictional force that prevents it from sliding?
Why is frictional force so difficult to understand? One reason is that frictional force is what I call a passive force, which is triggered by movement or a tendency to move. Another reason is that its existence is not as visual as other types of forces addressed in the primary school and secondary school syllabuses.
Indeed, objects around us always fall from a greater height to a lower height. And this demonstrates clearly the effects of gravitational force. Using a magnet to attract paper clips directly illustrates the presence of magnetic force. An object being pulled upwards by a stretched spring clearly indicates the existence of elastic force.
Even if an object at rest is subjected to a frictional force, the effects of it is definitely not as visual as the effects of some other types of forces. Therefore, for a situation in which the object of concern remains at rest, we need to examine the tendency to move instead of the actual movement to determine the existence of frictional force. It exists if there is a tendency to move.
Let us carry out a simple experiment using this block, which has four surfaces of identical area. The four surfaces were each pasted with a different material that imposes a specific amount of frictional force when in contact with the plane. Place the block on the plane with the green material facing downwards. The block does not move, and this is a situation of concern. As the angle of inclination is greater than 0 degree, the block is definitely subjected to a pull along the inclined plane due to the gravitational force. Hence, there is a tendency of the block to slide down the plane, and the block is subjected to a frictional force. If we decrease the angle of inclination all the way to 0 degree, the block is still subjected to the pull of the gravitational force, but the pull is vertically downwards Definitely not along the inclined plane. There is no tendency of the block to slide along the plane, and therefore the block is not subjected to frictional force. We can measure the frictional force using a data logger with a force sensor. Here, we shall carry out such measurement to confirm whether the frictional force imposed by the green material is larger than the white material. Place the wooden block on top of the cut. Since the cut has wheeled, the frictional force between the cut and the plank is very small. Once I tap the cut lightly, it starts moving. Look, I can make the cut move by pulling only the wooden block without touching the cut. What is the force that caused the cuts to move? Is it the pulling force that I applied? Not really, since I did not touch the cut at all. The correct reason is that the wooden block placed on top of the cut has a tendency to move ahead of the cut. This implies that the cut has a tendency to move away from the block in a relative sense, resulting in a frictional force between the cut and the wooden block. It is this frictional force that enables me to pull the cut without contacting it. Now, attach the cut to the force sensor secured on the plank. This time, however, when I try to pull the cut via the wooden block, the cut does not move because it is attached to the force sensor. Instead, it is the wooden block on top of the cut that moves. Look, before I exert a pulling force on the wooden block, the force sensor reading on the data logger is 0. When I apply a little force to pull the wooden block still does not move. But the force reading on the data logger is greater than 0. What does this reading represent? Well, let me explain. When the wooden block is pulled in this way, the frictional force which arises between the cut and the wooden block will be completely cancelled out by the force sensor secured on the plank. Otherwise, the cut would have moved. The amount of force required by the force sensor to completely cancel out this frictional force is displayed on the data logger. In other words, the force reading represents the amount of frictional force between the cut and the wooden block. If I increase the amount of pulling force, the reading on the data logger also increases until the point at which the wooden block starts to move, which is precisely the moment when the frictional force reaches its maximum value.
This experiment demonstrated that there is a maximum value of frictional force which a material can impose. However, it does not always impose this maximum value, particularly when the pulling force on the block is sufficiently small. The material will impose a frictional force smaller than the maximum value, but just enough to prevent the block from sliding. As the pulling force is gradually increased, the frictional force imposed by the material increases accordingly until it reaches the maximum value. Once the pulling force is increased further, this maximum frictional force cannot prevent the block from sliding, and the block indeed slides down.
Look, the maximum value of frictional force for this green surface of the wooden block is about 2.64 Newton. The maximum value of frictional force for this white surface of the wooden block is about 1.18 Newton. This confirms that the frictional force imposed by the green material is indeed much greater than the white material. I think you would agree that this way to perceive frictional force helps one gain a deeper understanding of the subject matter. I hope you also find this way to measure the amount of frictional force enriching. Thank you very much for your attention.